72 hours after Zorath Vel made his announcement on the council floor, the Drelith Armada crossed the edge of the Oort cloud and entered the Sol system. It was the largest invasion fleet assembled in over 300 years. 900 warships moved in tight formation, their dark hulls bristling with plasma cannons and shield generators. Behind them came the carriers, 300 massive vessels, each one holding thousands of short-range fighters in their launch bays. And behind those came the troop transports, sealed containers full of over 2 million Drelith soldiers, locked in cryogenic sleep, ready to be thawed and deployed the moment the fleet reached Earth. Zorath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Ironclaw, and watched the formations spread across his tactical display. The Ironclaw was the largest warship in the Drelith fleet, a vessel so heavily armored that it had once survived a direct collision with a small asteroid, and kept flying. Zorath had commanded it for 11 years. He had never lost a battle from its bridge. He looked at the distant yellow dot that was the human sun and felt nothing but contempt. This was going to be easy. Human space was quiet, poorly defended, and far from any potential allies. By the time the council even finished debating what to do, Earth would already be under Drelith control. His second-in-command, a veteran officer named Kale Dren, stood beside him. Kale was older than Zorath by 20 years, and had served in more campaigns than he cared to remember. He was loyal, but cautious, the kind of soldier who survived by asking uncomfortable questions. Kale asked if it bothered Zorath that they had received no resistance at all. No patrol ships, no warning signals, no defensive screens, nothing. The Sol system was completely silent. Zorath told him it meant the humans had no military worth worrying about. Earth maintained a small defense force, perhaps 50 or 60 ships at most, all of them outdated and poorly equipped. The humans spent their resources on science, exploration, and trade rather than weapons. They were a civilization of merchants and thinkers, not warriors. Kale nodded, but the unease did not leave his face. What neither Zorath nor Kale knew, what no species in the galaxy knew, was that 40 years ago, humanity had made a decision. It happened shortly after first contact. A Kelzari scouting party had stumbled into the Sol system and nearly opened fire on a human research station near Jupiter, before realizing the beings inside were intelligent. The encounter was tense, confused, and nearly violent. It ended peacefully only because the Kelzari captain happened to be a reasonable individual who chose communication over combat. But the message was clear. The galaxy was out there. It was full of alien civilizations. Many of them were old and powerful, and humanity had no way to defend itself against any of them. The governments of Earth came together in a rare moment of genuine unity. They argued for months and eventually reached a decision that would remain classified for 4 decades. They would present a peaceful, open, and cooperative face to the galaxy. They would join the council, sign trade agreements, and build friendships. But behind that calm exterior, they would quietly build the most advanced military defense network the galaxy had ever seen. They called it Project Longwatch. Over the next 40 years, while human diplomats smiled and shook alien hands, human engineers worked in absolute secrecy. They studied every piece of alien technology they could get their hands on. Kelzari shielding, Valori sensor arrays, Marathi weapon systems, and they combined it with something the aliens did not expect: human creativity. The alien species had been building weapons the same way for thousands of years. Energy beams, plasma cannons, particle lances. They were powerful, but predictable. Every species used variations of the same basic technology because that was what the galactic scientific community had agreed was most efficient. Humans did not care about what was most efficient. They cared about what worked. Deep inside the asteroid belt, human engineers hollowed out dozens of massive rocks and turned them into hidden weapons platforms. They installed magnetically accelerated railgun systems that fired tungsten rods at a significant fraction of the speed of light. The rods were simple, brutal, and nearly impossible to detect because they carried no energy signature. Alien sensors were designed to look for plasma charges and particle beams. A chunk of metal moving at extreme speed did not register as a weapon until it had already punched through your hull. On the moons of Neptune and Saturn, they built stealth listening posts that tracked every ship entering the outer solar system. On Phobos and Deimos, the two small moons of Mars, they installed orbital gun platforms disguised as mining equipment. On Luna, Earth's own moon, they carved out underground hangars large enough to hold an entire fleet. And then, there were the Phantom-class destroyers. The Phantoms were humanity's masterpiece. 48 stealth warships, each one built inside a hollowed-out asteroid near Jupiter, and never revealed to anyone outside Sol Defense Command. They were fast, nearly invisible to alien sensors, and carried a weapons payload that could gut a Drelith dreadnought in a single volley. Their hulls were coated in a material that absorbed sensor pings rather than reflecting them. To alien technology, a Phantom-class destroyer did not exist until it was already killing you. Captain Danny Kowalski stood on the bridge of the USS Blackwood, one of the 48 Phantoms, and looked at his crew. 160 men and women, all of them volunteers, all of them trained for this exact scenario. They had spent years running drills inside their asteroid, practicing attack patterns and emergency procedures, knowing that the day might come when they would have to fight for real. That day had come. Danny was not a man who gave speeches. He told his crew the situation in plain language. A hostile fleet was inbound. It was large. Their job was to hit it hard, hit it fast, and make the enemy regret every decision that had brought them to this place. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. If they were going to die, they would die making the other side pay for every inch. They nodded and went to their stations. Lieutenant Hannah Price took her seat at the communications and targeting console. She had spent the last 72 hours monitoring Drelith fleet transmissions, building a map of their formation, identifying the command ships, the supply lines, the weak points. She knew the enemy fleet better than most Drelith officers did. She told Danny that the Drelith had positioned their carriers in the center of the formation, protected by rings of warships on all sides. Standard Drelith doctrine. Predictable. The flagship, the Ironclaw, was near the back, which meant Zorath expected to command from safety while his front line did the fighting. Danny studied the display and said nothing for a long time. Then he asked Hannah what she thought would happen if 48 invisible ships appeared inside the carrier ring without warning. Hannah smiled and said she thought it would ruin somebody's day. 6,000 light-years away, on the council station, the other species watched and waited. Most expected the invasion to be over quickly. A few expressed quiet concern. The Marathi collective was already drawing up plans for how to divide human territory after the conquest. Only Arbiter Turun of the Kalzari seemed worried. He had spent more time studying humans than anyone else on the council. He had read their history, their literature, their military records. He knew things about humanity that most alien species preferred to ignore. During a private meeting with Ambassador Liesi, Turun shared a piece of information that made the old Valori stop moving entirely. He told her that less than a century ago, humanity had fought a war among themselves. Not a border skirmish or a trade dispute, but a full global conflict. It lasted 6 years and killed over 70 million of their own kind. They did this not with energy weapons or orbital strikes, but with chemical explosives, ballistic projectiles, and machines powered by burning fossil fuels. Liesi asked him how a species could do that to itself. Toruin looked at her with his heavy stone face and said that was exactly the question that should be keeping the Drelith awake at night. Because if humans were willing to do that to each other, there was no limit to what they would do to an enemy that threatened their home. Liesi sat in silence for a long time after that. In the cold darkness between Neptune and Uranus, the Drelith armada pressed forward. They moved with confidence and without caution, because everything their intelligence had told them said there was nothing to fear. Ahead of them, hidden in the ancient rock and ice of the asteroid belt, humanity waited in silence. The trap was set. The Drelith armada passed the orbit of Neptune without incident, then Uranus, then Saturn. With each passing hour, Zorath's confidence grew. The Sol system was exactly what his intelligence had promised: quiet, empty, and defenseless. He stood on the bridge of the Iron Claw and imagined how the conquest of Earth would be recorded in Drelith history. His name would be remembered for 1,000 generations. His fleet moved in a wedge formation, with heavy warships at the front and carriers protected in the center. Troop transports trailed behind, their precious cargo of 2 million soldiers still frozen in cryogenic sleep. The formation was textbook Drelith doctrine, the same pattern their fleets had used to conquer dozens of worlds over the past several centuries. It had never failed them before. They entered the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter at standard cruising speed. Zorath's sensor officers reported nothing unusual, just rock, ice, and dust, the same lifeless debris field that existed in countless star systems across the galaxy. Nothing to worry about. Zorath allowed himself a thin smile. In another few hours, they would reach Mars. After that, Earth was just a short jump away. That was when the silence broke. 12 objects buried deep inside 12 separate asteroids came to life at the exact same moment. They had been dormant for over 15 years, drawing just enough power from small fusion cores to keep their systems warm and their targeting computers updated. They were long-watch stations, humanity's first line of hidden defense, and each one carried a battery of electromagnetic railguns loaded with solid tungsten projectiles. The stations fired simultaneously. Each railgun accelerated its tungsten rod to a speed that made it nearly invisible to conventional sensors. The rods carried no energy signature. They produced no plasma trail. They emitted no radiation. Two Drelith detection systems, which were designed to identify the energy patterns of standard galactic weapons, the projectiles simply did not exist. Until they hit. The first volley struck the leading edge of the Drelith formation. 47 warships were hit in the first 90 seconds. The tungsten rods punched through energy shields as if they were not there, because the shields were calibrated to deflect energy-based attacks, not solid objects, moving at extreme velocity. The rods tore through hull plating, shattered internal structures, and exited through the other side of the ships, leaving catastrophic decompression in their wake. 47 ships, 90 seconds, no warning. The bridge of the Iron Claw erupted in chaos. Alarm signals screamed from every console. Officers shouted damage reports over each other. Zorath gripped the railing in front of him and stared at his tactical display, watching nearly 50 of his ships turn from green to red in the time it took him to draw a breath. He demanded to know what was happening. His weapons officer reported that they were under attack, but could not identify the source. There were no enemy ships on sensors, no energy signatures, no missile trails. Ships were simply being destroyed by something they could not see. Before Zorath could issue orders, the second wave hit. The Phantom Fleet emerged from the asteroid field like ghosts rising from graves. 48 stealth destroyers, decloaked in perfect synchronization, each one already locked onto a priority target. They appeared on Drelith sensors as sudden bright spots, there one moment and firing the next, giving the enemy no time to react. The USS Blackwood was the fourth ship to decloak. Captain Danny Kowalski sat in his command chair, with his hands steady on the armrests and his eyes locked on the tactical display. Lieutenant Hannah Price sat at the targeting console beside him, her fingers moving across the controls with the speed and precision of someone who had practiced this exact scenario 1,000 times. Their target was a Drelith carrier, designated Target Bravo 7. It was a massive vessel, twice the size of the Blackwood, carrying over 6,000 short-range fighters in its launch bays. If those fighters launched, they would complicate the battle significantly. Danny's job was to make sure that did not happen. Hannah reported that the carrier's shields were oriented outward, configured for a forward-facing threat. The Blackwood had decloaked inside the formation, behind the shield arc. The carrier's belly was exposed. Danny gave the order to fire. The Blackwood unleashed a concentrated volley of kinetic penetrators and guided missiles directly into the carrier's ventral launch bays. The explosions ripped through the fighter storage decks, detonating fuel reserves and ammunition stores in a chain reaction that tore the carrier apart from the inside. The massive ship broke in half, its two sections spinning away from each other in a shower of burning debris. 6,000 Drelith fighters died without ever leaving their bays. Across the asteroid belt, the other Phantom destroyers were doing the same thing. Each one had been assigned a high-value target: carriers, command ships, ammunition vessels, and each one struck with surgical precision. The Drelith formation, which had been so orderly just minutes before, dissolved into confusion and fire. Zorath screamed orders into his communication system. He told his captains to form defensive clusters, to raise shields on all axes, to find the enemy and destroy them. But his fleet was not designed to fight an enemy they could not see. Drelith's military doctrine was built around overwhelming force and frontal assault. They had never trained for an ambush. They had never needed to. The Phantoms exploited this ruthlessly. They fired, recloaked, repositioned, and fired again. To the Drelith it seemed like they were being attacked by an enemy that could appear and disappear at will. Some Drelith captains began firing blindly into empty space, hoping to hit something. Others turned on their own allies, mistaking friendly ships for cloaked attackers in the chaos. The Battle of the Asteroid Belt lasted 4 hours. By the time it was over, 112 Drelith warships had been destroyed, and another 31 had been damaged badly enough to fall out of formation. Humanity had lost 6 Phantom destroyers. 2 of those losses were caused by collisions with asteroid debris rather than enemy fire. On the Blackwood, Danny sat in silence after the engagement and looked at the casualty reports from the 6 lost ships. 427 men and women. He read every name. He owed them that much. Hannah came to stand beside him. She told him that the Drelith fleet was regrouping. Zorath had pulled his remaining ships into a tighter formation and was pushing forward toward Mars. He had lost over 100 ships, but still had more than 700. He was not turning back. Danny asked her if she was surprised. Hannah said she was not. She had studied Drelith psychology. Retreat was worse than death in their culture. A commander who turned back from a fight would be executed by his own officers. Zorath had no choice but to keep coming, even if it killed him. He said that was what he had been counting on. He opened a secure channel to Admiral Cortez and reported the results of the engagement. Cortez listened without interruption, and then told Danny to pull the Phantom fleet back to a secondary position near Mars. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was about to begin. As the Blackwood slipped back into the asteroid field and recloaked, the Drelith armada continued its advance. Zorath had managed to restore some order to his fleet. He placed his remaining carriers at the very center of the formation, surrounded by 3 layers of warships, with shields raised on all sides. He was learning from his mistakes, adapting to the human tactics. He was a veteran commander, and he was not going to be caught off guard again. But as his fleet approached Mars, new signals began appearing on his sensors. Weapons platforms on the 2 small moons, Phobos and Deimos, powered up, and revealed themselves. Long-range missile batteries buried beneath the Martian surface opened their launch doors. Thousands of intelligent warheads, each one carrying its own targeting computer, rose from the red planet like a swarm of angry insects. The warheads did not behave like normal missiles. They communicated with each other in flight, sharing data about Drelith's shield frequencies and defensive countermeasures. When the Drelith deployed electronic jamming, the warheads adapted. When point defense systems shot down the first wave, the second wave adjusted its approach vectors based on what the first wave had learned. Another 41 Drelith ships were destroyed in the Martian engagement. On the Galactic Council Station, 6,000 light-years away, the elder species watched the battle unfold on long-range sensor feeds. The chamber was completely silent. Representatives who had predicted a quick human defeat stared at their displays with wide eyes and open mouths. The Marathi collective's plans for dividing human territory had been quietly deleted from their data systems. Ambassador Liesi sat in her chair and watched the numbers. She watched the Drelith fleet shrink, ship by ship, volley by volley. She thought about Greg Hollowell's quiet smile as he walked out of the chamber 3 days ago. She thought about what Arbiter Toruwun had told her about human wars. She was beginning to understand. The humans had not been unprepared. They had not been weak. They had been waiting. Patiently, quietly, for 40 years, they had been waiting for someone to make exactly this mistake. The Drelith fleet that had entered the Sol system with 900 warships now numbered just over 500. Nearly 400 vessels had been destroyed or crippled across 2 engagements, and the Armada had not yet even reached Earth. The asteroid belt and Mars had bled them badly, and the survivors carried the scars: cracked hulls, damaged shield generators, half-empty ammunition stores, and crews that were beginning to understand they had walked into something far worse than anything their commanders had promised. On the bridge of the Ironclaw, Zorath Vel stood alone at the forward viewport and stared at the small blue dot in the distance. Earth. It looked so fragile from here. Just a tiny sphere of water and rock hanging in the black, with no visible defenses, no great orbital fortresses, no sign of the military power that had just torn his fleet apart. He hated it. His second-in-command, Kale Dren, approached from behind and spoke carefully. He told Zorath that their losses were beyond anything their war planners had projected. Nearly half the fleet was gone. Their supply lines were destroyed. Their fighter strength had been cut by 70%. He suggested, with as much respect as he could manage, that a tactical withdrawal might be the wisest course of action. Zorath turned and looked at him with black eyes that held no warmth at all. He reminded Kale what happened to Drelith commanders who retreated. The shame would follow their bloodlines for 10 generations. Their families would be stripped of rank and property. Their names would be erased from the historical records. Death in battle was glory. Retreat was oblivion. Kale said nothing more. He returned to his station and prepared for what he knew was coming. Zorath opened a fleet-wide channel and addressed his remaining captains. His voice was hard and sharp, like metal being dragged across stone. He told them that the humans had surprised them, but had not defeated them. 500 Drelith warships were still more than enough to conquer one small planet. He ordered a full-speed charge toward Earth. Every ship, every weapon, everything they had left. One final overwhelming strike that would shatter whatever defenses the humans had remaining. The fleet surged forward. They crossed the space between Mars and Earth in just under 3 hours. As they approached the Earth-Moon threshold, the boundary where Earth's gravitational influence became dominant, Zorath's sensor officers strained their instruments, looking for any sign of defensive positions. They scanned the Moon, the orbital space around Earth, the Lagrange points where stations might be hidden. They found nothing. For one brief moment, Zorath believed that the humans had spent everything they had in the asteroid belt and at Mars, that the hidden weapons and stealth ships were all they had, and that Earth itself was truly undefended. Then the moon lit up. 320 human warships emerged from concealed positions simultaneously. They rose from underground hangars carved into the lunar surface, detached from camouflage docking stations in Earth's orbital ring, and decloaked from stealth positions scattered across the space between Earth and the moon. They appeared on Drelith sensors like a curtain of light being drawn back to reveal an army that had been standing in the dark the entire time. This was the Sol Home Fleet, the force that humanity had built in absolute secrecy over 4 decades. The force that no alien intelligence agency had ever detected, because it had never once been deployed, tested in open space, or mentioned in any transmission that could be intercepted. It existed only in classified files, buried under mountains, and in the memories of the men and women who crewed its ships. Leading the home fleet was the flagship, a heavy battlecruiser called the USS Iron Prairie. It was not the largest ship in the fleet, but it was the most advanced. A vessel built with technologies that combined the best of human engineering with reverse-engineered alien systems, refined and improved in ways that the original alien designers would not have thought possible. On the bridge of the Iron Prairie stood Rear Admiral Nora Beckett. She was 54 years old, with silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a tight knot and gray eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her entire career in Sol Defense Command, rising through the ranks, not through politics or connections, but through a talent for tactical thinking that her instructors had described as almost frightening. She could look at a battle and see it the way a chess grandmaster sees a board, not just the pieces that were there, but all the moves that could follow. She had been waiting for this day for 30 years. She had hoped it would never come, but she had planned for it every single day, and now that it was here, she felt nothing but a cold, steady calm. She studied the Drelith formation on her display. They were coming fast, packed tight, committed to their charge. They had no reserves, no fallback plan, no escape route. They were going to hit the home fleet with everything they had, and hope that brute force could overwhelm whatever stood in their way. She had studied Drelith tactics for decades, and she knew their weakness. They thought in straight lines. They attacked from the front. They pushed forward, and they expected their enemies to do the same. They did not understand flanking maneuvers, envelopment, or the concept of controlled retreat to draw an enemy into a kill zone. She was going to teach them. Nora split the home fleet into 3 groups. The center group, 100 ships strong, moved forward to meet the Drelith head-on. The 2 flanking groups, each with over 100 ships, swung wide to either side, and began curving inward, like 2 arms reaching around to embrace the enemy formation. The center group engaged first. The clash was immediate and violent. At this range, the fighting was not the long-distance precision strikes of the asteroid belt. This was close combat, ship against ship, hull against hull. Energy weapons and kinetic rounds tore through the space between the fleets. Ships on both sides exploded and broke apart. Debris fields formed within minutes, creating a deadly maze of wreckage that made navigation almost impossible. The Drelith fought with everything they had. Zorath's captains were experienced warriors who had conquered worlds. They knew how to fight, and they knew how to die. Their ships absorbed tremendous punishment and kept firing. For a brief window, the battle seemed almost even. Then, the flanking groups arrived. Over 200 human warships closed in from both sides, catching the Drelith fleet in a massive envelopment. Ships that had been focused on the center group suddenly found themselves taking fire from 3 directions simultaneously. Their shields, already weakened by the frontal engagement, could not cover every angle. Gaps appeared, and human gunners exploited every single one. The USS Blackwood was part of the flanking force that struck from the Draelith rear. Captain Danny Kowalski drove his ship into the heart of the enemy formation at full speed, weaving between burning warships and spinning debris with a pilot's instinct that no training simulator could replicate. Hannah Price sat at her console and coordinated fire solutions not just for the Blackwood, but for 6 Allied destroyers in their immediate group. She linked their targeting systems together, creating a network that allowed them to concentrate their fire on single targets with devastating accuracy. One Draelith warship after another fell under their coordinated volleys. A Draelith cruiser scored a direct hit on the Blackwood's port side. The impact killed 11 crew members instantly and tore open 2 decks, venting atmosphere into space. Warning alarms screamed through the ship. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut. The lights flickered, and half the bridge consoles went dark. Danny did not flinch. He rerouted power from the damaged sections, sealed the breaches, and adjusted the ship's orientation to present its undamaged side to the enemy. The Blackwood kept firing. A second Draelith ship, a heavy cruiser twice the Blackwood's size, turned toward them and accelerated. It was attempting a ramming maneuver, a desperation tactic that meant its captain knew the battle was lost and wanted to take at least one human ship down with him. Danny saw it coming. He waited until the cruiser was committed to its trajectory, then rolled the Blackwood beneath it at the last possible moment. As the enemy ship passed overhead, close enough that Danny could see the individual hull plates through the viewport, he fired every weapon on the Blackwood's dorsal surface directly into its exposed engine core. The cruiser detonated from within. The blast wave rocked the Blackwood hard enough to crack 3 of its structural ribs, but the ship held together. Hannah looked at Danny. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say. On the Ironclaw, Zorath watched his fleet collapse. His tactical display was a sea of red. Over 300 more ships had been destroyed in the engagement. The remaining vessels were scattering, their captains abandoning formation in a desperate attempt to survive. The coordinated fleet that had entered the Sol system with such confidence was now a disorganized collection of broken ships running in every direction. Kael Dren approached him one last time. His voice was hollow. He told Zorath that it was over. They had lost. Zorath said nothing. Admiral Beckett hailed the Ironclaw on an open channel. Her voice was calm and measured. She told Zorath that he had one chance to power down his weapons and surrender what remained of his fleet. She told him that humanity did not enjoy killing, but that they would not stop until the threat was eliminated. She gave him 60 seconds to respond. Zorath reached for his communications console and cut the transmission. Nora waited 61 seconds. Then she gave the order. 12 human warships fired simultaneously at the Ironclaw. The flagship's shields collapsed in less than 3 seconds. The hull breached in 7 places at once. The reactor containment failed moments later, and the Ironclaw vanished in a blinding white flash that was visible from the surface of the moon. Zorath Vel and his entire command staff died in the fire. The remaining Draelith ships, fewer than 90, powered down their weapons and transmitted surrender codes. The Battle of the Pale Blue Line, as it would come to be known, was over. It had lasted less than 9 hours. Of the 900 warships that had crossed into the Sol system, fewer than 90 survived. Over 1.5 million Draelith soldiers, still frozen in their cryogenic pods aboard transport ships, became prisoners of war without ever waking up. Humanity had lost 41 ships and just over 3,000 personnel. The galaxy would never look at Earth the same way again. 3 weeks after the last Draelith warship surrendered, the Galactic Council reconvened on the orbital station above Valith Prime. The chamber was full in a way it had not been in decades. Every species in the Council, from the eldest to the youngest, had sent their highest-ranking representatives. Several had sent their actual heads of state, something that had not happened since the last Galactic War over 3 centuries ago. The mood in the chamber was unlike anything the Council had ever experienced. It was not anger or sorrow or celebration. It was something deeper and harder to name. The closest word in most galactic languages was the one used to describe the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and looking down, a mixture of awe, fear, and the sudden understanding that the ground beneath your feet was not as solid as you once believed. The elder species took their seats in silence. Ambassador Liesi of the Valori presided, as she always did, but even she carried a heaviness in her movements that was new. Arbiter Torun of the Kelzari sat like a mountain of stone, his expression unreadable. The Marathi Collective's representative kept his eyes on the table and did not look up. The Scythian ambassador, who had quietly supported the Dralith invasion with funding and intelligence, looked like a creature who had just realized it was standing in a trap. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened, and Greg Hollowell walked in. He moved slowly, the way he always did, with the measured pace of a man who had learned long ago that rushing accomplished nothing. He wore the same simple dark suit he always wore. His gray hair was neatly combed. His face showed the tiredness of someone who had not slept well in 3 weeks, but his eyes were clear and steady. He walked past the rows of alien delegates without acknowledging them. He reached the human seat at the table, the one that had been placed at the far end as a sign of humanity's junior status, and he sat down. He folded his hands on the table in front of him and waited. The council began. The Fulani ambassador spoke first, her feathered crest raised in agitation. She demanded a full accounting of humanity's military capabilities. She wanted to know exactly how many ships Earth had, what weapons they carried, and how long humans had been hiding this secret military buildup. She called it a violation of the Galactic Arms Limitation Treaties and demanded immediate transparency. The Marathi representative echoed her concerns, though his voice carried less conviction. He argued that no species should be allowed to maintain a hidden military of that size without council oversight. He said it was destabilizing. He said it was dangerous. Several others joined in. The accusations piled up. Treaty violations, deception, militarism. Some demanded that humanity disarm. Others suggested sanctions. A few quietly whispered that perhaps a coalition should be formed to contain this newly revealed human threat before it grew any larger. Greg let them talk. He sat with his hands folded and listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not object. He did not show anger or impatience or contempt. He simply listened, with the same quiet attention he had shown every day for 30 years of diplomatic service among species who had treated humanity as a minor curiosity at best and an irrelevance at worst. When the chamber finally fell silent, Greg spoke. He began by acknowledging that humanity had indeed built a military force in secret. He did not deny it or apologize for it. He stated it as a simple fact, the way one might state that water is wet or that stars burn hydrogen. It was something that had happened, and there were reasons for it. He reminded the council that humanity had first encountered the galaxy 42 years ago, when a Kelzari scouting party nearly opened fire on a human research station because they did not recognize the species inside as intelligent life. That encounter had ended peacefully, only through luck and the good judgment of one individual Kelzari captain. It could easily have ended in blood. He told them that in the years that followed, humanity had watched the council very carefully. They had watched how it treated young species. They had watched how trade agreements always favored the elder races. They had watched how border disputes were settled in favor of whoever had more ships, regardless of who was right. They had watched the Dralith conquer 3 smaller species with barely a word of protest from the council. They had seen how the galaxy truly worked, behind the speeches about cooperation and mutual respect. He paused and looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each representative in turn. He told them that over the past decade, Earth had formally petitioned the Council 3 times to impose sanctions on the Dralith Dominion for aggressive military expansion. 3 times, the Council had declined to act. The Dralith were too powerful, too well-connected, too important to the galactic economy. It was easier to ignore the problem and hope it went away. He reminded them that when Zorath Vel stood in this very chamber and announced his intention to invade Earth, not a single species had voted to stop him. Not one. Some had stayed silent out of fear. Others had stayed silent out of indifference. And at least 3, he said, looking directly at the Marathi and Scythian delegations, had actively supported the invasion with money, intelligence, and logistical aid. The Marathi representative opened his mouth to protest. Greg raised one hand, just slightly, and the alien fell silent. Greg told the Council that humanity had built its defenses in secret because the galaxy had taught them a very clear lesson over 42 years of membership. The lesson was simple. No one was coming to help them. When danger came, Earth would stand alone. The only thing between humanity and extinction was humanity itself. They had understood this from the very first day, and they had acted accordingly. He said that he did not come here to threaten anyone. He did not come here to demand anything. He came here to tell the truth, because the truth was the only thing that mattered now. The truth was that Earth had defended itself. The truth was that over 3,000 human men and women had died doing it. The truth was that those people had families who were grieving right now on a small blue planet that had done nothing to deserve an invasion except exist. And the truth, he said, his voice dropping low enough that every being in the chamber leaned forward to hear, was that if any species ever threatened human soil again, the response would not be defensive. He did not explain what he meant by that. He did not need to. The chamber was silent for a very long time. Ambassador Liesi was the one who finally spoke. She had lived for over 800 years. She had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. She had seen species at their very best and their very worst. She was not easily moved. But something in Greg Hollowell's words had reached her. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity of a man who had every right to be angry and chose instead to be honest. Perhaps it was the weight of 3,000 names that hung in the air like smoke. Perhaps it was the simple recognition that humanity had been failed by the very institution that was supposed to protect all species equally, and had survived anyway, through nothing but their own will. She stood and addressed the Council. She said that in all her centuries she had never seen a species fight with such ferocity and then speak with such restraint. She said that humanity had earned something today that no treaty or trade agreement could provide. They had earned the respect of the galaxy, not by conquering others, but by refusing to be conquered themselves. She formally moved to grant humanity a permanent seat on the Senior Council, not as a junior member, not as an observer, as a full and equal partner in the governance of the galaxy. Arbiter Turun seconded the motion immediately, his deep voice echoing through the chamber like stone grinding against stone. The vote was unanimous. Even the Marathi and the Scythian voted in favor, because at this point, voting against humanity seemed like an extraordinarily poor decision. In the weeks and months that followed, the galaxy reorganized itself around a new understanding. The Dralith Dominion was stripped of its military capacity. Their remaining fleet was dismantled under joint human and Kelzari supervision. Their conquered territories were given the right to self-governance. Zorath Vel's name was not erased from Dralith history, as he had feared retreat would cause, but it was remembered as a cautionary tale rather than a legend of glory. The species that had secretly funded the invasion found themselves facing quiet but firm diplomatic pressure from Earth. No threats were made. No ultimatums were issued. But human ambassadors began appearing in their capitals, smiling politely and discussing new trade agreements that somehow always favored Earth just a little more than before. The message was clear, without ever being spoken. Back on Earth, the celebrations were brief and muted. There were memorials instead of parades. 3,000 names were carved into a wall of black granite at the Sol Defense Command headquarters, and Admiral Vince Cortez stood before that wall for a full hour on the day it was dedicated, reading every single name in silence. Captain Danny Kowalski returned to New Houston with a promotion he did not want and a medal he never wore. He went back to Rosie's diner, sat in the same corner booth, and ordered the same plate of eggs. Lieutenant Hannah Price sat across from him, drinking coffee and reading alien transmissions on her personal scanner, the same way she had on the night everything started. They did not talk about the battle. They did not talk about the 11 crew members they had lost on the Blackwood, people whose faces Danny saw every time he closed his eyes. They sat in comfortable silence and watched the sun set through the window, golden light spilling across a world that had survived because the people on it refused to kneel. Admiral Nora Beckett retired 6 months after the battle. She moved to a small house on a quiet stretch of coastline in Maine, where the waves came in slow and steady, and the sky went on forever. She spent her mornings on the porch with coffee, watching the ocean, and thinking about nothing in particular for the first time in 30 years. When a reporter tracked her down and asked what she wanted people to remember about the battle, she thought for a long time before answering. She said she wanted them to remember that peace was the most valuable thing in the universe, that it was fragile and required strength to protect, and that the people who kept it safe were not the ones who wanted war, but the ones who were willing to fight so that others would not have to. Greg Hollowell remained on the council station. He continued his work with the same quiet patience he had always shown, attending meetings, drafting agreements, building the slow and unglamorous architecture of interstellar cooperation. But the other ambassadors noticed something different now. When Greg entered a room, every representative stood. It happened naturally, without discussion or protocol. It was not a rule. It was not a tradition. It was simply what they did, because they understood now what the man in the simple dark suit represented. He represented a species that had been underestimated, threatened, invaded, and nearly destroyed, and had responded not with vengeance, but with a calm and steady insistence on being treated as equals. He represented Earth, and from that day forward, no one in the galaxy ever made the mistake of forgetting it. The Galactic Council had ruled the known galaxy for over 40,000 years. 12 elder species sat at the crescent-shaped table inside a massive orbital station that floated above the neutral world of Valith Prime. They governed trade, settled border disputes, and kept the peace between hundreds of civilizations spread across thousands of star systems. They were old, powerful, and very sure of themselves. Nothing surprised them anymore. Until today. The session had started like any other. Trade complaints, mining rights, a minor territorial argument between two insect-like species on the outer rim. The usual business. Ambassador Liesi of the Valerie, a tall and graceful being with silver skin and 4 slender arms, presided over the meeting with the calm patience of someone who had lived for over 800 years. She had seen empires rise and fall. She had watched entire species destroy themselves. Very little moved her anymore. Then the Drelith delegation entered the chamber. The Drelith were reptilian, broad-shouldered, and covered in dark green scales that shifted color when they were angry. They were one of the younger elder species, having earned their council seat through military conquest rather than diplomacy. They respected strength above all else and viewed kindness as weakness. Their empire spanned 60 star systems, and they maintained one of the largest standing fleets in the galaxy. Commander Zorath Vel walked to the center of the chamber floor. He was tall, even by Draelith standards, with a scarred face and eyes like polished obsidian. He wore a black military uniform decorated with the bones of enemies he had killed in personal combat. He moved with the slow confidence of someone who had never lost a fight. He stood before the council table, pressed his clawed fist against his chest in a Draelith salute, and spoke. He announced that the Draelith Dominion had authorized a full military invasion of the Sol system. 900 warships, 300 fighter carriers, and over 2 million ground troops would cross into human space within 72 hours. The target was Earth. The objective was total submission or total destruction. For 3 full seconds, the chamber was completely silent. Then it exploded. Ambassador Liesi rose from her seat and demanded to know if the Draelith had lost their minds. High Arbiter Toruin of the Kelzari, a massive stone-skinned being who rarely spoke, slammed his fist on the table hard enough to crack it, and called the plan reckless madness. The Felani ambassador, a small feathered creature with enormous eyes, began making a high-pitched distress call that echoed through the chamber. Zorath waited for the noise to die down. He was not worried. He had expected this reaction. He told the council that humanity was a young species. They had only been part of the galactic community for 42 years. They were fragile, soft-bodied, and lived on a single planet orbiting a very ordinary star. They had no great fleet. They had no empire. They had accomplished nothing of significance on the galactic stage. And yet somehow they had been given protections and trade agreements that species 10 times their age had never received. The Draelith believed this was unfair. More importantly, the Draelith believed it was an opportunity. Earth was rich in resources. Its oceans alone contained more biological diversity than most entire star systems. Its people were clever but divided, always fighting among themselves over politics and borders and ideas. Zorath believed that a single, overwhelming strike would break their will entirely. He expected the whole thing to be over in less than 6 standard days. Several council members tried to argue. The Valori cited ancient treaties. The Kelzari warned of consequences. But the council had no enforcement mechanism. It was a governing body built on consensus and tradition, not military power. If the Draelith wanted to invade, there was nothing the council could actually do to stop them. And several species had no interest in stopping them at all. The Marathi Collective, a corporate species that dealt in weapons and minerals, quietly supported the invasion because war was profitable. The Scythian Empire had old grudges against humanity over a trade dispute and would be happy to see Earth humbled. At least 3 other species saw an opportunity to claim human technology or territory once the fighting was over. No one voted to intervene. While the council argued, a single human sat in the back of the chamber. His name was Greg Hollowell. He was 63 years old, thin, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. He wore a simple dark suit, the same kind he had worn every day for the 30 years he had spent among alien cultures. He was not a soldier, he was not a general, he was a diplomat, and he was very good at his job. Greg had listened to Zorath's announcement without moving. He had watched the council argue without speaking. He had seen the fear on some faces and the greed on others. None of it surprised him. He had spent his career learning how the galaxy worked, and the lesson was always the same. Power respected power. Everything else was decoration. When the noise finally died down, Greg stood. Every eye in the chamber turned to him. He was the only human present, and they expected him to beg, to plead, to demand protection from the council that had just failed to protect his world. He did none of those things. He looked directly at Zorath Vel. His expression was calm and almost sad. He said in a quiet voice that carried through the entire chamber that he sincerely hoped the Drelith had prepared their last wills and said goodbye to their families. Then he straightened his coat, nodded politely to Ambassador Liesi, and walked out of the chamber. Nobody stopped him. Nobody spoke. The doors closed behind him, and the silence stretched on. 6,000 light-years away, on a warm evening, in the city of New Houston, Texas, Navy Captain Danny Kowalski sat in a corner booth at a small diner called Rosie's. He was 41 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped brown hair, and a face that looked like it had been carved out of patience. He had a plate of eggs in front of him that he was eating slowly, the way he did everything, with no rush and no wasted motion. Across from him sat Lieutenant Hannah Price, his co-pilot and communications officer. Hannah was 30, red-haired, and had the kind of sharp, restless intelligence that made her excellent at her job and terrible at sitting still. She had a personal scanner on the table next to her coffee, a device she used to pick up alien transmissions as a hobby. Most of what she caught was routine traffic, merchant ships, navigation beacons, tourist broadcasts from the outer colonies. But tonight, she caught something different. She set down her fork and picked up the scanner. Her eyes narrowed. She adjusted the frequency and listened for a full minute without speaking. Danny watched her and said nothing. He knew that face. Hannah looked up. She told him she was picking up Drelith military chatter, encrypted, tight-beam, and far too close. It was coming from just outside the solar perimeter, near the Oort cloud. That was not a place where Drelith's ships were supposed to be. Danny set down his coffee. He pulled out his phone and made a single call to Admiral Vince Cortez at the Sol Defense Command, a man he had known for 15 years and trusted completely. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. When Danny hung up, Hannah asked what the Admiral had said. Danny looked at her and said just 2 words. Wake up. Somewhere deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a bunker that did not officially exist, Admiral Cortez entered a code into a terminal that had not been used in over a decade. Across the solar system, from the frozen moons of Neptune to the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, hidden stations began to power up in perfect silence. Project Longwatch was awake, and Earth was ready.